Ooh, ooh. Kiss Shorty Gaming Nation in the building, going live. Like, share, follow, and subscribe. Fix my damn headband and my flag and my glasses and shit. We in for a ride today. We're not for a ride today, no man. I'm gonna switch to the Yardman device because men don't want cosplay Black American veteran. Even though they mimic our language and they go to Jamaica and they speak how we speak and they mock our accent, but that's not them cosplaying us. But it is what it is. When a black American gets a tattoo of Chinese writing on his arm, is that him cosplaying Chinese people? We don't know. When a black American wears a three-piece suit, is that him cosplaying European? We don't know. See, black Americans are accusing us of cosplaying them, but they cosplay white people all the time. But they don't want to delineate from white people. But it is what it is. Let's get into it. 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 Native American groups practiced forms of slavery or captivity before Europeans arrived. Pre-contact slavery was widespread but culturally varied. Among many tribes, taking captives in war was common. Captives might be adopted into tribe, ransomed, and traded or kept as forced laborers. Some tribes, like the Comanche, Apache, Haida, Tlingit, and whatever the hell, developed extensive raiding networks to capture other indigenous people for servitude. In the Pacific Northwest, slavery could be hereditary. Some enslaved people were born into that status. In the Southeast, Creek, Chickasaw, Choctaw captives could be held for labor or ritual purposes. Now, let me go back. There was a video that I did a review. It's going to drop on the channel. Um, let me see if I can find it. Give me 1 second. Um, Crimson Cure. Shout out to Crimson Cure. And I have to go review. Oh, she did Black Woman and the Rise of Witchcraft. Crimson Cure, I created a character, the type of black woman to avoid in the dating market. I call her the cultural witch. And there's another character I call the Hotep Succubus, right? If you look up my YouTube channel, I have I think it's 10 women to avoid for the traditional black man to avoid during dating. So she did something about black women in the rise of witchcraft. So shout out to the Crimson Cure, right? Um, that's because I critique you, don't mean I hate you. But when y'all say stuff, I gotta correct it. So hold on. Give me 1 second. I'm trying to find a clip of Crimson Cure. So let me go here. Share this. This. I'm probably going to do a couple reviews on this. So remove that first, and then add this up here. Then we're going to do this.
We survived the HIV, and the gender war is not just about genders. They've thrown everything they largely because we typically address those individuals in our community who are willing to sell out. Whereas you look at African culture, and we can refer back to the daughters of the trade, they literally mechanize and culturalize.
See, that's disingenuous. You say African culture, right? You can say Western Africa or Nigeria, or you can say, and I'm not defending them, because if an African or Jamaican come up here and we make a sweeping generalization, like Black American culture or Black American men sell drugs or do dope, you're going to say we're being racist. But you guys are doing the same thing you don't want us doing, or you accuse white people of doing to you, right? You're going to say, see, this is what they think about us. This is how they feel. Yet, FDA called Black Caribbean blacks banana boats and jerk chicken niggas and oxtail eaters, and bully and make fun of us. But we can't push back. If we push back, we're seen as we don't like them or delineate them, or we keep them away from them.
European slave trade, and I'm going to argue that, but for their participation in the transatlantic slave trade, colonization would have never happened, because those Europeans would not have had a foothold on the west coast of Africa. The typical European would only last at most a year on the west coast of Africa without help. But because these women married into these, they saw monetary opportunity, and they married into it, and they took advantage of it. And so, again, culturally speaking, it's important that the foundation of Black American culture survive, because we've adapted as a group of.
Okay, so that's the context of what I'm doing this, right? So he said that there was no slavery, and in this side of in North America, it only existed in Africa. Well, I have the evidence and the receipts to back up that what you said is wrong, sir. Pre-contact slavery was widespread, but culturally varied. Among many tribes, taking captives in war was common. Captives might be adopted into the tribe, ransom traded, or kept as forced laborers. In the Pacific Northwest, slavery could be hereditary. Some enslaved people were born into that status. In the Southeast, example, Creek, Chickasaw, Choctaw captives could be held for labor or ritual purposes, right? If you remember that movie Apocalypto, what were those Aztecs doing to those natives? They were enslaving them, and they were blood sacrificing them to whatever god, right? Which the Tainos, which like in Jamaica, right? My bloodline is Taino, right? I believe the Caribs, they used to enslave the Tainos, and the Caribs used to eat and cannibalize the Taino. And what happened was the Tainos partnered up with the Spanish or the British or whatever group that came along to get help to beating the Caribs, right? I might show that history on here, right? So to say that slavery never existed here, pre-colonial, pre-European, that's a lie, basically, frankly put, right? So let's get it. The social role was different from European chattel slavery. In many Eastern woodland tribes, captives were often ritually adopted to replace lost family members, effectively become part of the tribe. In others, like the West Coast tribes, slaves were property and had fewer rights, closer to European concept. In some plains cultures, female captives could be taken as secondary wives, while male captives might be used for labor or traded. Really? Really? I told you, y'all not going to like me. Because this is not me coming up with it. This is the research. Documented. But you're going to say it's white supremacy. You're going to call me a tether. Whatever y'all want to say. Evidence comes from multiple sources. Archaeological records show evidence of fortified villages and mass burials that suggest warfare and captivity were common. Oral history and early European explorers' writings, Spanish, French, and English, document the existence of enslaved captives long before colonization took root. For example, Armando di Sato 1540 expedition describes seeing native tribes in the southeast holding other natives as slaves. Anthropological studies, like those of the anthropological Bruce Trigger, note that indigenous slavery existed independently, but the arrivals of Europeans and their demand of slave labor dramatically expanded and intensified it. All right. So, I had a thought, and I'm gonna save it for another video. What changed after European arrival? The demand from Europeans, especially in the Caribbean and the American South, transformed native captives taken into commercial slave trade. Tribes like Chickasaw and Creek became major suppliers of native slaves to European colonists. Let me say this again. The demand from Europeans, especially in the Caribbean and American South, transformed native captives taken into commercial slave trade. Tribes like Chickasaw and Creek became major suppliers of native slaves to European colonists. The European concept of racialized hereditary chattel slavery was not the norm before contact. That was imposed later, which is a lie because earlier you had slaves that were married into families, female slaves married into families. So what do you think they were doing with those female slaves that were married into families or took in as secondary wives? What do you think happened? All right. In short terms, yes, many Native American societies enslaved each other before Europeans came, but was often tied to warfare, kinship, replacement, or ritual, and not necessarily racialized. Well, it doesn't have to be racialized. You're still enslaving your own group of people, right? Lifelong bondage, Europeans introduced after. Remember, he said that they have addressed the sellout culture within Black America or FBA, but have they really? Right? Have you acknowledged that there was slavery amongst FBA and Native Americans, or as your logic, the FBA said they were the original Native Americans or inhabitants here in the Americas, right? Will you acknowledge that? Will you address that? I don't think so. After colonizations, the native practice merged with and was often exploited by a transatlantic slave system. Slavery predated European arrival. Indigenous slavery long predated European colonization, with evidence from monument, codex, archaeological findings, and early European accounts indicated that Native Americans enslaved one another. Examples include Maya and Aztec sacrificing captives, Iroquois, mourning wars, and the Pacific Northwest captive exchange. Right? Widespread. So Maya and the Aztec sacrificing captives. Right? So this was in Apocalypto. Right? Widespread and regional varied. Slavery was widely practiced across regions and time. In North America, slaves were traded along transcontinental networks. The Haiti, I don't know how to say these names, right? But you get the point. Pacific Northwest, hereditary slavery. In the Pacific Northwest, slavery was hereditary. Captives were prisoners of war, and children born into captivity likewise became slaves. So that means that they were practicing a form of chattel slavery, right? In some groups, up to 1/4 of the population consisted of slaves. Among the Maya and Aztec, slavery arose from warfare, debt, and criminal punishment. Maya captives were used in temple buildings and human sacrifice, while Aztec law mandated enslavement for certain crimes like theft or embezzlement. Slavery in these societies could be hereditary unless ransom was paid. All right. Cultural context over economic exploitation. Unlike European chattel slavery, indigenous forms of captivity were often embedded in spiritual, social, or kingship structures. Adopted captives, ritual interrogation, or fulfilling debt obligations. Broad-scale economic exploitation was rare, and racial inferiority was not a factor. Well, of course, it's not going to be racial inferiority because it's amongst other natives. It's not like natives enslaving Europeans. You're doing it amongst each other, right? Social acknowledgement. Academic consensus support that indigenous boundary systems existed for hundreds or thousands of years before Europeans. These forms are complex and varied, but undeniably pre-colonial. So Black Americans or FBA, if you say you're the original inhabitants of North America, that means that you too were involved in enslaving of your own kind and selling out each other. And then you sold when the Europeans came, you didn't resist them. You sold yours to them too. You participated in that economic thing, just like the West Africans did with Africa. All right, but I'm a tether, so anything I say, you don't go look it up. Don't go do the research. Claim, yes, supported by multiple historical practice, varied significantly across. So you have to take your time to read that. All right, pause the video and then read that. Slavery is still slavery. At its core, slavery is still slavery because you're talking about one human being held against their will and treated as property, regardless of cultural packaging. The difference, historians point out, aren't to excuse it, but to explain how it functioned. Scope and scale. Pre-contact native slavery was generally smaller in scale. Europeans and some West African kingdoms involved in Atlantic slave trade industrialized it into massive global economic engine. What did I want to say earlier? Capitalism, right? They look at capitalism as wicked because capitalism was used to produce this massive inhuman event right here, right? And in my opinion, if the Native Americans were able to do the same, they would engage in the same shit, right? So capitalism is not the enemy; it's how people use it that becomes negative, right? Because West Africans didn't have to enslave each other. Europeans didn't have to be in demand of slaves from West Africans, right? Nor did Native Americans have to do this. They didn't have to do that, but they did it, right? Scope and scale. Pre-contact native slavery was generally smaller in scale. Europeans and some West African kingdoms involved in the Atlantic slave trade industrialized it into a massive global economic engine. Many native systems allowed for adoption, ransom, or eventually freedom, while others, like among the Pacific Northwest tribes, could be hereditary, which is similar to chattel slavery, right? Commodification. Europeans and West Africans in the transatlantic slave trade reduced enslaved people almost entirely to economic commodities. In some native societies, captives also served as ritual, kinship, or symbolic purposes, right? That said, if someone is captured, can't leave, is forced to work, and can be traded or sold, you can absolutely call that slavery without any mental gymnastics. What often happens is people hear it was different and think historians are trying to soften it. But really, it's just pointing out the form was different before Europeans, not the more weight or is lighter. Not the more weight is lighter. The more reality is that is the same. It's coercion and denial of freedom, right? A lot of times I use ChatGPT, right? So, and then I ask ChatGPT to fact check me. And then y'all can go do the research yourself. Y'all don't gotta take my word for it. So y'all can pause the video and y'all can look this stuff up. Yeah, so slavery was practiced by all three groups, but the scale, racialization, permanence, and economic emphasis differ significantly. Native slavery often had social or ritual functions beyond mere economic exploitation, but still involved forced captivity and loss of freedom. West African slavery was complex and varied, at times involving both captives and economic trade with Europeans. European chattel slavery was systematic, race-based, lifelong, and commodifying millions, underpinning vast colonial economies. Right? Several Native American tribes did enslave captives from other tribes and sold or traded them to European colonists during the colonial period. This practice became part of the complex alliances and conflicts between indigenous groups and European settlers. Here are some key points. Southeastern tribes such as the Chickasaw Creek and Cherokee engaged in raiding neighboring tribes, just like the West Africans, were captives, some of whom were sold to European colonists as slaves. These tribes often allied with European powers, British, French, Spanish, and gained military advantage or economic benefit. The Indian slave trade was a significant part of the colonial economy. In some regions, especially in the Southeast and Carolinas, Europeans supplied firearms and goods in exchange. So you remember that picture with the pilgrims? Let me see if I can find it. Let me see if I can find it. Pilgrims. Let me see if I can find that. Pilgrim. You remember this? Share this tab, view it, at the stage, remove that, at the stage. All right, put my face here. Go ahead. You remember these? The pilgrims? The little Thanksgiving table where the Native Americans are sitting around. I don't know if they show it here, but these are the pilgrims and the Native Americans. They're having a Thanksgiving. All right. And if you notice, there are photos where, like, look at this right here, where the Native Americans have guns on them and weapons. Right? No, that's not it. Look right here, right? But the Native Americans, see right here, the Thanksgiving table, there goes a nigga with the feather on his head, right? They're eating, everybody cool. How you don't think that these were the Native Americans that were selling slaves to the Europeans? And a lot of times you'll see that the Native Americans would have guns and rifles and shit and weapons. Right? So to the Native Americans or FBA, you're not innocent in your downfall or demise. Right? I remember growing up watching cartoons and they would show things like this, right? Anyway, let's get back to it. So European supply of firearms and goods in exchange for slaves, intensifying intertribal warfare and slave trading. It was the same thing West Africans was doing. The native to European slave trade lasted roughly from 17th through the early 19th centuries before practice largely declined. Right? So, same timeline as the West African slave trade, right? In summary, Native American groups did enslave other Native Americans and participated in selling captives to Europeans, often as part of broader political and economic strategies during colonization. This practice was well documented by colonial records and historians. All right. And I'm giving you the sources, right? So you could take a pause and you can look at the bottom. All right. Giving you the timeline of the war. Look at this. Yamasee Confederacy, allied with other tribes raided rival groups partly to capture slaves for trade with the English. The intense pressure from this Indian slave trade contributed to a Yamasee War against South Carolina colonists in 1715. After the war, the Indian slave trade in the Southeast declined but did not disappear entirely. So you had Native Americans selling out each other for the benefit of what is Carolina as a hub. The colony of South Carolina became a major center for Indian slave trade in the late 1600s and early 1700s. Native tribes supplied a significant portion of the slave labor to plantations before the large-scale importation of African slaves. Colonial officials and merchants actively encouraged the trade to supply labor and weaken hostile tribes, right? So with that meaning, instead of Indian tribes, they just use African slaves. Numerous British and Spanish French colonial documents record transactions and agreements involving native slave trading. For example, the British colonial governor records include details of trading native captives as slaves in exchange of firearms for captives. Summary. Several tribes, including the Chickasaw, Creek, Cherokee, and Yamasee, participated actively in capturing and selling native captives to European colonists. This trade had significant impacts on intertribal warfare, colonial economies, and Native American societies. It was an important and well-documented part of colonial history in southeastern and southern United States. Now, this is the discussion. In recent discussions with some foundational Black American circles, there's a strong understandable desire to reclaim identity and history by asserting that Black Americans were the original inhabitants of the Americas before European arrival. This claim challenges mainstream narratives that often reduce Black history primarily to the trauma of slavery and overlooks the deep contributions of Black people throughout history. However, when examining this claim closely, especially in the context of indigenous histories and realities of pre-contact America, it is important to apply consistent logic and historical evidence to build a credible and honest narrative. Which I agree. I agree if Black Americans believe you're the original inhabitants of America, prove it. Right? I believe that Caribbean Blacks, because my grandmother was Taino, that we are the origins of the Caribbean, or at least you had Black people before the Great Cataclysm, when you had a bridge that connected the place, that connected everywhere. You had dark melanated people that were traveling to the Caribbean islands. So you could have very well have my pigmentation already here in the islands before European contact was it. So I believe that. So Black Americans believe that. Go, you know what I'm saying? Do your thing. All right, do your thing. Do your thing. Historical and archaeological records robustly show that indigenous peoples, those who migrated from Asia via a barreling land bridge thousands of years ago, which is what they call Atlantis, that bridge that sunk, they call that the city of Atlantis, right? Were the original inhabitants of the Americas. These societies developed rich, complex cultures with diverse languages, social systems, and yes, practices that include forms of captivity and slavery. Importantly, Native American slavery was multifaceted. It could involve ritual, adoption of captives, hereditary bondage, or outright trading of enslaved people. Some indigenous tribes engaged in selling captives to European colonists, forming complex social and economic relationships well before African enslaved peoples arrived in large numbers. Right? Consistency in historical logic. The foundation of Black American communities assert their ancestors were the original inhabitants or deeply intertwined with Native American groups pre-contact, it logically follows that they would share in complex realities of indigenous life, including the practice of slavery or captivity. To reject this reality while embracing original inhabitants risk oversimplifying history or creating selective narratives that do not fully reckon with the difficult aspects of human societies. It is crucial for any credible historical narrative to recognize that all peoples, including indigenous Americans and Africans, have histories containing both triumph and contradiction. Enslavement within communities, while deeply painful, was a reality for many societies worldwide, and acknowledging this does not diminish the dignity or resilience of these people. Y'all could take the time to read this. Let me read this last part. Slavery is slavery no matter how you dress it, up or soften the language. One tribe enslaves another, they are taking away another human being's freedom, right? When Europeans arrived, some Native American tribes didn't just resist, they actively participated in the European system of racial chattel slavery. They raided other tribes to supply slaves to European colonists, trading human lives for guns, goods, and political advantage, which is what West Africans were doing. So you did the same thing over here, FBA. Indigenous people were not innocent victims or bystanders in the history of slavery. They made choices that contribute to the perpetuation of slavery on these continents. Acknowledging this is not about blaming, but about truth telling. It's about understanding the full picture of history, which includes uncomfortable truths on all sides. Recognizing this complexity strengthens our grasp of the past and makes our conversation about race, history, and justice more honest and meaningful. All right. I want to look at ChatGPT for a moment. Give me 1 second. Question. Just like with the daughters of the slave trade, did you have European men being allowed to marry into Native American tribes amongst Native American women to help them their European survival rate better here in the Americas um, during the Pilgrims? Oh shit! Let me make sure this is added to the stage. Y'all can look this up yourself. Let me make sure I zoom this motherfucker in. Hold on. Can I zoom this motherfucker in? Can I zoom it in? Hold on, nigga. Nah, nigga, we ain't doing that. We doing this. Can I zoom this nigga in? Nah, nigga, what you doing? Yeah, we gonna zoom this nigga in. So I'm gonna have the bitch read. I'm gonna have the bitch read. I'm gonna have the bitch read. The AI bitch read. That's how I read it.
Great question. It touches on a complex and important part of early colonial and Native American history. Yes, there are historical records showing that some European men married Native American women during the early colonial period, including the time of the Pilgrims and later. These marriages and unions often served multiple purposes: survival and alliance building. European settlers were new to the land and unfamiliar with local conditions, so marrying into native tribes helped create alliances, trade relationships, and increase chances of survival in unfamiliar territory. Cultural exchange. These unions sometimes bridged cultural gaps, allowing knowledge, language, and customs to be shared between Europeans and native peoples. Political strategy. For some native tribes, marrying European men into their communities could provide leverage or protection from rival tribes or European powers. However, it's important to note the context. Unlike the forced and exploitative system of chattel slavery and the daughters of the slave trade phenomenon, many of these early marriages were at times consensual alliances, but they still existed within a framework of colonialism
on a
and unequal
bomba cloud,
power
hear that?
dynamics. Native
No,
tribes had
man,
their own
man,
customs.
man, let's stop that, Gala. No, shut up, Gala. Unlike the forced exploitative systems of child slavery and the dollars of the slave trade phenomenon, many of these early marriages were sometimes consensual alliances, but they still existed within. So, the dollars of the slave trade that was forced, but many of the marriages were at times consensual alliances within the Native American framework. So, who's the bigger sellout? Western Africa, where those women were forced to marry? Hold on, let me ask this question. So, what you're saying, ChatGPT, is that the marriage with the Native American tribes and European men were more consensual, and the dollars of the slave trade in West Africa, those were forced. Is that what you're saying? Oh, yeah. So FBA, you, no, let the AI bitch read it. Hold on. All right, so let me ask. So can you fact check any of this? Fact check this. Fact check everything. Give me a moment. Be right back. Oh, so let's read this.
Absolutely. Here's a fact checked breakdown based on current historical scholarship regarding European Native American marriages and the daughters of the slave trade in West Africa. 1. European men marrying Native American women. Historical consensus. It is well documented that many European men, especially fur traders, settlers, and missionaries, married or formed long-term unions with Native American women during the 17th and 18th centuries. Consent and alliances. These marriages were generally consensual and served as political alliances, survival strategies, and trade partnerships. Native tribes often had matrilineal systems and tribal customs that allowed women to hold significant agency, including choosing partners and integrating outsiders into their societies. Examples. French fur traders in Canada, the coureurs de bois, commonly married native women, giving rise to the Métis people. In New England, some European settlers married into tribes or lived alongside native communities in cooperative arrangements. The Pequot and Wampanoag tribes had marriages with English settlers, sometimes formalized in Christian ceremonies, sometimes not. Power imbalance. There were undoubtedly imbalances and colonial pressures. Europeans had military and economic power, and diseases brought devastation. But these unions were not generally coerced in the same way as slavery. Many native communities actively chose these alliances. 2. Daughters of the slave trade in West Africa. Historical consensus. The term daughters of the slave trade often refers to African women who were captured, sold, or otherwise forced into slavery during the transatlantic slave trade. This system was brutal and coercive. Forced nature. The transatlantic slave trade involved the capture, kidnapping, and forced sale of millions of Africans. While some African elites and traders participated in the trade by capturing or selling rivals or criminals, the overall system was exploitative, dehumanizing, and non consensual. Women's experience. African women were forcibly taken and sold as slaves or concubines on European ships, often enduring horrific conditions. Consent was virtually never part of this dynamic. Ah, some aspect European Native American marriages, daughters of the slave trade, West Africa, Benez, spell. Ash, summary. Nature of relationship. Mostly consensual, political social alliance, forced, coerced, and non consensual. Agency of women, retained some agency in partner selection, virtually no agency, victims of capture and sale. Cultural integration. Europeans sometimes integrated into tribes. Women forcibly uprooted and commodified. Historical purpose. Survival, alliance, trade, cultural exchange. Exploitation, commodification for labor and profit. Sources for further verification. Richard White, The Middle Ground, Indians, Empires, and Republics in the Great Lakes Region, 1615. James Axtell, The Invasion Within, The Contest of Cultures in Colonial North America. Philip D. Morgan.
So y'all get the point, right? So this brother, he actually doesn't know what he's talking about. No disrespect.
Black people they saw money on the west coast of Africa. The typical European would only last at most a year on the west coast of Africa without help. But because these women married into these, they saw monetary opportunity, and they married into it, and they took advantage of it. And so, again, culturally speaking, it's important that foundational Black American culture survive, because we culturally helped. We would not have had a foothold in the slave trade. Colonization would have never happened, because those Europeans would not have had a foothold.
And by that logic that I just broke down here, Europeans would not have had a foothold in colonization in the Americas if the Native Americans and FBA, you know what I'm saying, didn't consensually marry or create alliances with those Europeans. You ever think that maybe that same logic applies? Because remember, the difference is that the West African women, they were forced. So let me ask ChatGPT this question. So you're saying that the daughters of the slave trade, and I'm referring to the material of the daughters of the slave trade, right? Are you saying that those women were forced, or was that consensual? Because remember, in that book, they were saying that you had the women who are of Ghana that were being groomed to be concubines for European men to marry. So you're saying they were forced, or was this consensually done? Uh-huh. So, let's see this. So, it's proper that we break down the context.
Thanks for clarifying. You're referring specifically to the material often called Daughters of the Slave Trade, which focuses on West African women, particularly in places like Ghana, who were groomed or selected to be concubines or wives for European men involved in the slave trade. Here's the nuanced fact-checked answer based on historical research. Were the daughters of the slave trade women, forced, or consensual? The reality is complex, and historians debate the degree of agency versus coercion. In many West African coastal societies involved in the transatlantic slave trade, elite women were sometimes groomed or positioned to serve as concubines or wives to European traders. This could be part of political and economic alliance building between local African elites and Europeans. These arrangements were often negotiated within local social and political structures and could be viewed as strategic consensual partnerships, especially among elites. African women from powerful families might have been placed in such roles to secure trade advantages or status. However, this did not mean full freedom or genuine consent as understood in modern terms. These women were still part of a larger system that commodified human beings and involved significant power imbalances. At the same time, many women and lower status individuals were forcibly taken, sold, or trafficked against their will into slavery and concubinage. Summary: Group likely experience: elite women groomed as wives'
What was that?
concubines, more agency, negotiated alliances, strategic but constrained by power dynamics. Non elite women and enslaved individuals, forced, trafficked, little or no consent, victims of capture and sale. To clarify, elite African women groomed to be concubines or wives to Europeans were often part of complex social arrangements that combined strategic alliance, economic benefit, and limited agency. Most enslaved women involved in the slave trade were forcibly taken and had no choice in their fate. The existence of some strategic alliances or grooming does not erase or minimize the brutal, coercive, and violent nature of the overall transatlantic slave trade system.
So the brother made it seem as if like all of the West African women chose to do that. No, there's a separation. There's a separation between the elite women versus the non-elite women. The non-elite women were forcibly taken. The elite women had agency, right? But they were still constrained by power dynamics, right? And at the same time, and at the same time, when you go back up, no, not at the same time, excuse me. When you roll back up and look at Native Americans, there's no distinction between. So let me ask that. So when it comes to Native American tribes, was it that same way? Was there a difference between the more elite Native American women versus the lower class women that were forced, or was they all in general just consensual? No, look at this. Look at this. Elite versus non-elite Native American women. Elite Native American women, example, daughters of chiefs or important leaders were often married off or allied strategically to European men to strengthen political alliances, trade relations, and military support. These marriages tended to be negotiated within the tribe and generally involved some level of consent or at least tribal approval. Hence, the alliances served that. By the way, y'all don't hate white men like y'all say. All these different indigenous groups talk in America talk about how the white man is wicked and evil, and how the white man is this, and how the white man is bad, and how white man toxicity and white privilege that, and all blah 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 blah. Yeah, y'all was married into these men. European FBA who claimed to the originator. It's your fault why this European man getting a foothold here in America. It's your fault. If your FBA or Native American women were not marrying off by consensual choice into these European men, they also would not have a foothold over here to sell African slaves over here, just like over there in Western Africa where they were more forced. Right? Not only Native American women also form relationships or marriages with European men, but the records show more variation. Some are consensual relationships, while others may have involved coercion and exploitation, especially as colonial pressures increase. Consensual but within complex power dynamics. Even with elite women, elite Native women, consent in modern sense is complicated. These marriages serve political and economic interests and were often arranged by families or tribal councils. The Native women will generally retain agency through their community, social, and kingdom structures. Many tribes were matrilineal, so women had significant influence over family and clan decisions. Damn! Woo! Woo! So that means that a lot of Native American tribes were technically matriarchal, and the women were doing this. The women in in FBA Native American culture we're doing this. No, FBA is gonna find a way to separate the two now. Watch. They're gonna cut their whole neck off to suit the body. Contrast with enslavement or forced relations. Unlike transatlantic slave trade systems in West Africa and the Americas, where forced enslavement and commodification were central, Native American European marriages generally did not involve systematic forced enslavement or trafficking of women. However, there were documented cases of sexual exploitation and abuse by settlers, especially as European colonization intensified and power imbalances deepened. Well, that would not have happened if you didn't have FBA or Native American women or matrilineal matriarchal families allowing European men to marry into the women and getting the foothold here in America. So it's your fault. Man, oh man. Let me ask something. What's the difference between a matriarchy and matrilineal, or are they one and the same? Before I go to that, final thought. While many Native American European marriages involve consent, and tribal strategy, it's important to recognize that colonialism introduced many abuses and exploitations. So the experience wasn't uniform. By systematic forced enslavement like that seen in the transatlantic slave trade, wasn't typical in Native marriages with Europeans. So systematic forced enslavement, like that seen in transatlantic slave trade, wasn't typical in Native marriages with Europeans. So, doctor, let me put my face on the screen. West African slave trade was more brutal, harsh, and forced. Meanwhile, during the Native Americans, it was more consensual. It wasn't as brutal and harsh, and you chose willingly, consensually, for power and political gain. And the reason why European men were able to gain a foothold here in America to bring their diseases and bullshit over here, because you allowed them to let them in. You had matriarchal societies and you have matrilineal societies that made that decision. Don't blame me. Research that shit yourself. A social system of society, women hold primary power and political leadership, more authority and social privilege, and control over property. Women dominate, women control decision making in community. Rarity, true marriage directors, women hold most of all political power, extremely rare in human history and anthropological. Most societies describe it as matriarchal, often better term matrilineal or what? This word is new to me. Matrilineal, definition, system of tracing descent, inheritance in the family lineage through the mother's side rather than the father's side, which I don't understand that. But whatever. Children belong to their mother's clan or lineage. Property titles of clan membership pass to the female line. Women may have significant social status as lineage carriers, but political power is not necessarily held by women. Men may still hold leadership positions. Commonly, matrilineal societies are fairly common around the world. Many Native American tribes, like Cherokee and Haudenosaunee, whatever that word is, some African groups and others follow matrilineal descent. Woo! So you had Native American women over here telling out other black or FBA or whatever you want to call them to European men for political gain and power. So you have not addressed the sellout culture within here. You have black American women today, whether they're FBA or whatever, selling out black women to liberal left, or selling out other black women, especially black men, to white leftist Marxist European powers. So you haven't addressed it. But anyway, I'm with Tether. So what do I know? This is Kiss Journey Gaming Nation. Like, share, and subscribe. And you FBA. I hope I sparked something for other Caribbean blacks to speak out, because y'all are telling lies. And you think that y'all gonna get away with the lie you're telling. And the lie you're telling is that you were acceptive and receptive of Caribbean blacks, and you never bullied us, you never picked on us, you never called us any name, and you can't understand why we don't want to be black like y'all. When y'all said y'all weren't, you told us we were not black like you. The first person to make that distinction between cultures is Black Americans telling Caribbean blacks that we're foreign black, we're outsiders, and we're not black like y'all. And y'all said that shit during the 60s and 70s and the 80s. But anyway, Kiss Shorty Gaming Nation. Like, share, follow, and I'm out. Bomba class.